Hi, everyone. Welcome to FC Build. We're going to wrap up day one. And before I sort of dive into the details, I'll quickly do an introduction to Foundation Capital for those of you who are new to FC Build. We were founded in 1995. We're an early stage venture capital firm with a little over 30 IPOs to our credit. Our two primary investment areas are fintech and enterprise. In our enterprise practice, we invest in everything from applications down to the infrastructure and dev tools and databases and cybersecurity, everything in between. We're predominantly a seed and a Series A investor. More often than not, we're investing before a company has any revenues or even a product. Essentially, we invest in dreamers that have the desire to build an extraordinary company, and we work with you to make those dreams real. So if you have one of those dreams, please get in touch with me or one of my partners at Foundation Capital. But with that, introduction, let's talk about one of the dreamers we have with us today, Josh Reeves. Josh, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure. And I actually like that framing. One of our values at Gusto is dream big and then make it real. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about both parts of that in this conversation.
I am looking forward to doing that. For the audience, Josh started Gusto along with Edward Kim and Tomer London soon after graduating from Stanford. It was a little over 10 years ago, and the company's now worth around $10 billion. So $10 billion in 10 years with 200,000 customers. That's the number that really stuck with me, Josh, as we were preparing for this. Very few companies have 200,000 customers, so I'm sure there's a lot of lessons you've learned. And we're really appreciative of the fact that you're willing to take a trip down memory lane. So thanks again.
Yeah, thrilled to be here and eager to share some learnings.
So why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about your founding story? How did you come up with the idea and what triggered the decision to start a company?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, actually, November this past month was our 10-year anniversary, and I feel like we're still very, very early in this journey. It's about 20 years since I was in school, so that's very kind of you to say recently graduated, but the white hair on my head attests to that.
You hide it well.
But yeah, how did we get into this space? I mean, Tomer, Eddie, and I, just to give a little bit of backdrop, when we were in school back in the day, all were electrical engineering alumni from Stanford. So how do three electrical engineers end up really dreaming and thinking a lot about the way companies are built and how people interact in a business? Well, two reasons. Number one, we had all run prior small startups. So I had run a small 3-4 person company. Eddie and Tomer had run their own small startups, and startups are small businesses. So we had experienced the pain ourselves of setting up things like payroll, health insurance, onboarding some new employees and contractors. So that was kind of one catalyst for us to even be aware of, hey, this could be made better. This could be made easier and simpler. And then we also, each of us have family who have run small and medium-sized businesses. So we had kind of that exposure point as well. And we got excited about, hey, if it's not just us feeling this pain and family, but many, many more folks feeling this pain, then there's an opportunity here.
And so you decided there was an opportunity. The three of you had worked together, studied together. So it was an obvious team. What's next? How did you go about doing it?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, we actually hadn't worked together. So, to any of the teams out there that are starting out from scratch, a lot of times it's just getting in and start doing a project, start actually collaborating. And at that time in our life too, it really was all that we were doing, right? 15, 18 hours a day. And one thing that did really align us nicely, though, was we wanted to tackle a really big problem. And we really all connected around this idea that companies don't exist for the sake of it. We exist to go fix something for the customer. And we'd all at least had these prior startup chapters, which were really big learning experiences for us. So for us, there's a bunch of different interconnected problems we're trying to fix at Gusto. But the one we started with is really around payroll, right? That's kind of what we are probably most well known for. And what was really interesting back then and even today was the realization that the payroll market itself is really, really fragmented. And then especially at small and medium-sized businesses, you have a lot of folks doing it by hand on pen and paper, making mistakes, getting penalized. And so we had a hypothesis that you could build a modern system, leverage paperless mobile cloud, a lot of things that we all take for granted today as the ingredients for modern software, and actually build something that required no training, no background in building a business, could be really powerful, accurate, but also be really simple and easy and intuitive. And we launched in December of 2012 in California only, really scoped to a specific kind of new business profile as our kind of early customer segment, and we're off to the races.
You know, one of the things that, Silicon Valley usually talks about is this notion of you're either growing really fast or you're failing, sort of the fail fast to grow quickly story. You had a very different philosophical approach. You talked about durability and accountability very early in the journey of a company. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and why that was so important to you in the growth of Gusto?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ingredients that affected us and that perhaps affect many entrepreneurs here. One of them was just motivation. Like we had all run these prior smaller startups. When we came together to start Gusto, we really wanted to tackle a big problem and ideally spend decades trying to make it better. So this backdrop of, hey, let's go really try to make it better and spend a long time doing this kind of already takes, one out of the, just near term, immediate, whatever is in front of you headspace, because we're going to hopefully be doing this. We've done it for a decade. We want to do it for many more decades. So that was one helpful kind of motivation ingredient. I think the second, just really clear in our space, is that we're doing stuff that has to be done correctly and accurately. People are trusting us to go move money that's not ours. We've moved, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars now on behalf of our customers. And when you set up in our product, again, 10 years ago today, same dynamic, but 10 years ago, even more of a hurdle. You're giving us a bunch of personal information, you're giving us bank information, and then we're debiting funds from your account. So making sure that we always took that trust very seriously was a key ingredient. And then I think the third one probably is a little bit more based on our experience in Silicon Valley, but we really wanted to not just focus on the what, the strategy, the product, the customer, but the how of company building. Like, are we actually building the company in a way we're proud of? And what does that even mean? How do we even have that conversation? Right? This is not a grow fast at all costs, no matter what the consequence. No, there's very clear checks and balances that we had to kind of put in place, and we're always trying to get better. But those are some of the ingredients that affected our journey there.
That's super helpful to hear. And what are some of the implications of those decisions? I mean, did you end up having to make hard decisions that, in hindsight, were the right ones, but in the moment seemed really hard?
Yeah, I'll give an example, probably more from the earlier days for entrepreneurs that are early in their journey. So, what I share right now is just a bit on philosophy, but to make it tactical, we launched in California, and we had these waiting lists of customers, leads really waiting for us, businesses that wanted to use Gusto in other states. And we had an avenue back in 2013-ish to go to more states with a more partial solution, probably still add value, definitely make more revenue, but it would have actually been not a full featured experience. And we actually took longer to get to nationwide coverage. It took us till 2015 actually to get to all 50 states. And we were working really hard. It was a big focus and priority, but it actually took that time to do it in a way that we were proud of, and we thought effective and thoughtful and consistent with our values. And I'm really glad we did it. It definitely left revenue on the table in that period, but set us up much better for the following chapter of growth and expansion of the product.
Yeah, that's a hard trade-off. It sounds like it's worked out well, but with investors putting pressure to grow faster, that's not always an easy decision to make in the short term.
Well, I think the nice balance here is back in those days, you're still growing 10x a year anyways. So, obviously there's a more robust way to do forecasting at the stage we're at now. We are proud of the growth, but I think, again, it goes back to this idea of checks and balance. Is it growth at all cost? Well, what does that mean? And how do you define that line is the thing I would encourage entrepreneurs to think about. And for us, the checks and balance fall in three buckets, by the way. It's like business model. When we look at our gross margin profile, CAC profile, rebuilding a sound business, that's a healthy one for everyone. Two is in our product quality and our customer experience, things like NPS, and are we actually delivering a great experience to the customer? And if that's flagging, we have to make sure that slower growth is a good thing to catch up and be back to where we want to be. And then we call it Gusty experience, but our team, if obviously we're growing in a way that is counterproductive to people's career paths and growth and development, and we have attrition happening, then that's not healthy or sustainable either. So I encourage, again, leadership teams and founders to think about, like, what is your check and balance? What is your equation that at least causes you to have a conversation about, hey, what are we giving up? And are we growing, too slow can be a pitfall too. Or are we growing too fast, frankly?
Before we start talking about sort of the journey more, at every stage, one last question around sort of the founding story. All three of you, are children of immigrants. Did that in any way shape or influence your background or your decisions, or the background of the company and the decisions you made in the early days?
Yeah, I think, as people, that obviously has had a huge impact on our lives. And I'll just give quick background. So Tomer himself is an immigrant. He grew up and was born and raised in Israel, came out to Silicon Valley for his graduate studies. Eddie's from Southern California, but his parents are immigrants from Korea, South Korea. And then my mother is an immigrant from Bolivia, came to the US when she was 18 to go to school. And so, one of the lessons I take from that, that I'm really grateful for, is when you have an immigrant in your family or are an immigrant, and this can come through other avenues as well, you kind of, by definition, have this mindset of I can turn nothing into something, right? Which is kind of what entrepreneurship is all about. This idea that you can, to your point, dream, think of something, start with a hypothesis, start with a pain point, have a belief in how you can improve it, but then create something out of nothing is one of the most intoxicating, fulfilling, exciting parts about entrepreneurship. And it's a team effort.
Yeah.
But I love that example. And I think, definitely my mom is an immigrant coming here, not speaking the language, knowing no one, putting herself through school, getting a job, getting a career, creating a whole foundation, to me is actually entrepreneurship. It's a different type of entrepreneurship, but I have just as much respect for it.
Absolutely. Well, it's been 10 years, as you said, and, you started from nothing and you have 200,000 businesses now using Gusto. I'd love to go back to the early days and talk about the business in its first few stages. How did you find the first few customers, the first few hundred? And then we can go from there.
Yeah, I think the lesson here is really around focus. So for us, one of the early hypotheses we had, I alluded to, is we're going to start with really smaller businesses because the landscape, very fragmented. You add up some of the bigger providers like ADP, Paychex into it. They had less than half of the market themselves. So very fragmented, but especially at smaller businesses. And those were the folks that were most in pain, most ignored, most inaccessible historically, because you both couldn't really acquire them cost effectively. High touch outbound sales programs don't work at this ACV profile. And then also you didn't have the right technology ingredients. You really needed things like cloud, paperless, and mobile to even build a product that was viable, because it has to be more self-serve. It has to be leveraging, hardware the person already has in their pocket. And so we wanted to start again with a scope of California, new businesses, and outside of the friends and like family type kind of word of mouth. It was really just starting with the PR piece and the announcement of, hey, we're here, and then word of mouth. So we actually today still really focus a lot on organic growth, that word of mouth, that high referral rate, that high NPS, enabling what we call land and expand, powered by customer love, is kind of our core business model. And really, it was fascinating to see, because you would see a pocket of, like, in the middle of a part of California I've never been to, a church joins Gusto, and then a month later there's like 4 more churches in that county. You're like, how did that happen? Well, of course there was some type of meeting or some type of interaction where they recommended it to someone else. And I really like that alignment, especially if you're focused on SMB. You have to deliver a real valuable product experience, otherwise you're not going to earn that word of mouth.
That's such a fun story. A church in the middle of nowhere, and then suddenly there's 4 of those. I remember seeing WhatsApp's growth in the early days. It was very similar. Literally, they would light up a new country, and out of nowhere, you'd have thousands of users in a few days. But for an enterprise company like yours, where there's no natural network effect, it's not like a communication product. As you said, the cost of a sales-driven model doesn't add up. What are some of the things you did when you go back to the really early days that you think other founders could learn from in terms of acquiring the first few thousand customers?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll focus on the early days. Just to note, today we've expanded our market quite a bit. So, to be clear, we actually definitely have sales teams for our larger kind of customer segments, bigger companies, and then we also have a broad swath of additional products, features like health benefits, et cetera, that play into that go to market. But if I think back to the earlier days, really we had 2 routes to market. It was a direct business, really fueled by organic. We did the best we could on amplifying word of mouth referrals. We started a content program, which continues to pay dividends today and requires just consistent investment. It's a slow build, but it becomes really valuable over time. We actually did obviously some paid programs as well, but more to augment that core organic engine. And then the other thing I'll note here, and this hopefully is a viable path for other companies too, but indirect. So we've continued to have a very robust indirect channel for Gusto. This is us working with accounting firms. So when you're thinking about your go-to-market, think about, is there a stakeholder or someone in the mix who's going through their own type of transformation themselves? In our case, there's a lot of small accounting firms across the country. And many of them themselves had been ones doing payroll by hand, not really liking it, definitely not a high margin business for them, kind of more of a cost of keeping and retaining a client.
Yes.
And so when we came to them and said, hey, we'll do that thing that you don't really want to do anyways, and you can get the credit for it, you can kind of set them up on Gusto, refer and route them to us, and we're going to help you focus on more value add parts of your business. And that's now expanded really robustly. We have a whole program called People Advisory where we can certify and train accounting firms and professionals on how to become a people advisor and help their customers with more, again, value add activities. It can be a win-win. And that's a network effect for us because on the direct side, we have these small businesses joining and we have them add their accountants to Gusto. And then those accounting firms now have one client on Gusto, and we try to get more and more of that book of business onto Gusto. And it's thousands of accounting firms today now that work with us pretty closely.
That's so cool. I mean, and it's amazing how you found network effect in a business that wouldn't have been obvious at all. Let's take the next step now. You've got a few thousand clients. You have, the word of mouth going. You figured out a channel. What was the hardest part about going from, let's say, 10,000 to 100,000? What are some of the big challenges along that journey?
Yeah, I think of one that's more like strategy market centric and then one that's more internal. So maybe starting with the internal side, we were talking right before this about the phase of growth when you're just kind of 10xing every year. And we definitely had our moment of like, oh, we'll just 10x next year. And then, oh no, wow, like to run a multi-100 person company, even with the best of intent, right? We always want to get better. There's a lot more robust muscles you have to build around things like FP&A and how you actually do budgeting and how you think about these things that I had not done before, right? This was the biggest company I've run. So that's one that I'll definitely flag, like knowing the right stage. For us, it was at a couple hundred employees to start building some of that structure. It can really be an unlock. One of the things that we'll probably talk about later that's been really helpful to us is horizon planning. This ability to think about kind of what is our core business today, our core customer, our core business model. What are adjacent business models, adjacent products, adjacent customers, and then what are some of these more discontinuous customer leaps? And then how do we budget, headcount, resource, time, talent across all three? So that's kind of one big kind of growing pain, learning experience, which we can unpack if you want. And then the other kind of related to horizon planning, but it's kind of when do we start doing more than just payroll, right? So for us, health benefits became a really big investment kind of around that same time period. And how do we incubate new products and layer them on top of our existing product motion as we expand our product and do both in real time? Is something that every tech company needs to become good at, and we had to go through that journey as well.
Got it. Let's unpack the first one. You sort of gave me a lead in there, so I'm curious. Let's dig in.
Yeah. So on the kind of the planning and talent kind of bucket.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what was really helpful for us was thinking about. And it coincides with a couple other things, right? So bringing in more senior leadership, kind of my job shifting out of like doing anything IC centric. I joke a big part of my job is to fire myself from as many jobs as I can. So, on that accountant channel sales program, like I was the sales rep. I was going to accounting conferences. I was going and signing up, accounting firms. That had to end pretty quickly as we added more folks to that team. But at this couple 100 person size stage, it was really now at this point, can I bring in the right executives and promote the right leaders inside Gusto to kind of be at that level? And then really building out a planning process that didn't restrict us, hopefully unlocked us, but created focus. And so to summarize that, again, hopefully relevant to other companies here, and not rocket science, but like today, Gusto really operates on 3-year kind of cycles, right? We really like we have our vision, mission, our view of the future that's indefinite and farther out. But like over the next 3 years, what does success look like? What is the driving force? What are the big bets we're taking? What's compounding and growing? What's new and different? And then within that, we do pretty robust annual planning and mid-year planning processes where we just validate and check in on those assumptions, decide if it's worth changing or modifying that. And the biggest unlock here is focus. Like how do we as a company holistically, when we're past the number of people that I can just go talk to one-on-one, all say, hey, here's what success looks like for this year or this next 6 months or the next 3 years. So that's one of the biggest kind of things we had to iterate quite a bit on to get to a better place. And we're still iterating and trying to get better today.
I want to drill into this 3-year plan because most startups talk about having a long-term plan, but they usually build it at the time of a fundraise and they promptly forget about it the moment the fundraise is over and you start again the next fundraise. So it sounds like you put in place a much more rigorous planning process early on. How early on was that? When did you start doing 3-year plans?
Yeah, so the first one we did was in, I want to say 2017, because we called it G20, or 2020, kind of had that whole nice play on
Yeah.
clarity and focus. Um, but yeah, the company, let's see, in 2017 was right around probably 500 people. We had now multiple products in market. We had started expanding a bit around our customer segment. We had, several executives in the organization, but we're really trying to figure out, how do we get to the next level? How do we get to the next stage? Um, and and then, yeah, we've kind of never looked back. I would say, like, there's probably a dynamic where doing it too early would be overly constraining, but yeah, the 3-year planning process, and then the 5-year budget model. We actually have a 5-year kind of financial model that goes further than 3 years. Really, it's just a core part of how we work today, and we use kind of an OKR type process to back into then the actual activities, goals, and accountability checks to see if we're on track towards those plans.
Very cool. And so for all of the entrepreneurs out in the audience, I think once you're at 400 people, you said that's probably the right time to at least start thinking about a 3-year plan.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe I'll add one thing here, Ashu. Like, if there's a lot of folks in the audience that are more like product centric, and you're like, hey, why is Josh talking so much about planning? Here's my approach to it that actually makes me smile and not be frustrated. I think of it as, how do we unlock potential, right? Like, at the end of the day, as a leader, my job, outside of being very involved in strategy around product, market, and kind of direction, is like, how do we take this group of people that have chosen to be on this journey and set up the ingredients and the infrastructure so that they can all achieve their potential? And like, that's actually, to me, as fascinating and interesting a puzzle as things like product strategy, right? Like, how do people, and probably a little bit because our product is called the People Platform and all about people, I'm uniquely more maybe passionate about this. But I would argue almost any founder, entrepreneur can get excited about this concept of, how do you kind of unlock the potential of people on your team. It's something that I've found really rewarding.
Yeah. It sounds like your leadership style has evolved and must have needed to evolve. At probably pretty early on, this became the largest company you've ever managed, and it's continued to be that. Can you talk a little bit about how your style has evolved? What are some of the mistakes you made along the way and learned from?
Yeah, for sure. So I think maybe some things that have stayed consistent, I would like to think, and across Gusto, is we have a pretty strong point of view on values, and like we've talked about that a bit. We actually, to give a little bit more context there, when we were 3 people, kind of codified these values that, again, were not something we kind of came out of thin air with. It was, when the 3 of us were working, what about the way we work do we want to replicate and maintain? And then what do we want to change and be open to new perspectives on? And that became our values. Things like service mindset, like really, really finding folks who celebrate helping others, right? Is not a thing every company needs to have, but is a really key ingredient to be successful at Gusto. And so, you know, from that lens, servant leadership, service mindset has been a pretty big due north for me. Like, part of my upbringing, my parents both became teachers. My dad was a high school teacher. My mom's an elementary school teacher, or was before they retired. Like, you learn service mindset pretty quick if your parents are teachers. So that's been pretty consistent. Now, how it's changed is on every single part of how I actually spend my time, right? I can think of many phases of evolution here, from doing a lot of IC work. One of the ways we split responsibilities early on was, my 2 co-founders ended up focusing more on the product and engineering side, and I focused much, much more on the go-to-market, customer acquisition, and kind of business operations side. And so, filling all the different leadership roles attached to that became quite relevant. And then I would say at this stage, especially with COVID and all the changes to the way we work, we've also grown headcount in the last, year significantly, right? Over, 70% plus headcount growth. So lots of new folks joining Gusto. I'm still trying to keep evolving my role, but fundamentally, I think about it as team building. I build our board team, I build our investor team, and I build our executive team. And then beyond that, I'm obviously very involved in things like all hands and our planning process to help set direction and strategy. Beyond that, then I want to be of service. I want to be available as a resource to teams. I don't want them to wait for my permission. I want them to loop me in if I can be of assistance to them. Is a big part of my approach to the role.
That's super helpful, and it is a very unusual style. This notion of constantly thinking of yourself as a servant leader isn't always a natural style, at least in Silicon Valley. And it sounds like it's something that came to you, just as part of your upbringing. What are some other dimensions of your leadership style that you'd love to share with other founders?
Yeah, and maybe the one thing I'll most highlight is like whatever one's authentic to is to me the most important thing. When I hear advice too, it's we don't want people to become chameleons. I get advice and perspective from lots of leaders. We have the good fortune of having, 10, 15 CEOs and founders as our angel investors. And so it's been awesome to learn from them over the years. Um, but the biggest advice I've ever gotten is play to your strengths, be authentic. And we do want to be a case study. I would like to be a case study in really proving that one can be, you know, humble and really ambitious. One can be kind and incredibly competitive, right? Like we have really big, ambitious goals on how we can actually solve these pain points, serve customers well, do it in a way we're proud of. And I believe the ingredients to go help millions of companies and hundreds of millions of people out there. And the outcome will be a company that I'm confident can become orders of magnitude more valuable than we are today. But that's a byproduct, right? The motivation for me is about wanting to solve these problems. I think another leadership trait I can point to is, you know, puzzle solving. I love taking complex systems, deconstructing them, and finding out what makes them tick. It can be how we do onboarding. It can be how we do pricing. It can be how we do product development. It can be our technology infrastructure. It can be the way that we do, performance reviews. I find all of it fascinating. That might not be the dynamic for everyone listening, but I find all of it pretty interesting, and I like being more horizontal than diving specifically deep into one area.
And it's cool. I was interviewing Ali Ghodsi, the CEO of Databricks, in the morning, and he said something very similar. He talked about systems thinking and applying his systems thinking and systems problem solving to every aspect of the go-to-market. And
Yeah.
for him, as he started to do it, he realized the key is to put structure and process, figure out what the root causes are, and solve it with some system or process, as against with a hack.
Yeah, and the joy comes, to your point, from like making it better and then making it better in a repeatable, scalable, sustainable way, so that then I'm not involved in that specific thing. And that's like I didn't know if I was going to love this job, this role at this stage. I love it because fundamentally the job at this point is all about problem solving, and it's all at complex, structural, very system centric levels. And the only thing you have to get around and over is, mostly it's the stuff that's most not working or most frustrating because everything else can be solved by other people. So, I like that. I like tough puzzles.
Well, one of the puzzles I'm sure you've had to spend a lot of time on is the culture. When the company's 10 or 20 people, the culture is really a manifestation of the founders. But today you're 2,000 employees, and so I suspect you've had to make a conscious effort to define that culture and to evolve it over time. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we really think of culture, our language at Gusto is more focused on values and traditions. So values I alluded to earlier, I don't think there are, the right values for all companies, frankly. It's a combination of what's authentic, what's consistently amplified, and what's also consistently acted upon in any company. And if someone, for example, is not aligned with our values at Gusto, they're not a bad person. It just means I believe they would do better work in a different company. And so, we codified that pretty early on. I think the evolution of how we screened for it, because it's mostly been in hiring, was, I interviewed everyone up till about 50, 60 people. That doesn't scale. But that was kind of phase one. Then we had like a few people I knew who did a very similar type of interview focused on motivations and values, trying to suss out really what drives someone, how they approach work, what they get energy from, what they get, what takes energy from them. And then that got us to like 150, and then that was not scaling. And then we created a program that now has scaled. We call it our VMA, our Values and Motivation Alignment Interview. And it's a cohort of folks that get trained every year that basically become really good at doing this interview. And every candidate coming through Gusto has this as a part of their hiring panel. It's a VMA interview, we call it. And so that's been one ingredient, I would say, so that when people join, they already have this common approach. They have wildly different backgrounds, but a common approach to the way that we want to do the work. And then traditions, traditions are formed by anyone. They can be organic. They have to be ad hoc. They have to be serendipitous. Some have been created by me. A lot have been created by other Gusties. Those are the two things I would point to in the context of culture that I think are important for any company, not just Gusto.
What's one of the notable traditions that you'd like to share that would be an interesting lesson for other people?
Well, probably one that people have known about, or at least like to spotlight, which itself will, evolve, frankly. But we started the company in a house in Palo Alto. My co-founders and I were raised in homes where we took our shoes off, and so, up until pre-COVID, all of our physical offices, we would take our shoes off in the office. We'd walk around in slippers, give out socks to folks. And it was just a unique tradition at Gusto that was authentic. The team, when we moved to our first office, the team was like, "Hey, can we keep doing this?" And I was like, "Sure, why not? Like, it's up to us, right?" And so that's been a unique tradition that, we'll see how it evolves. We're now starting to come back into the office. And again, traditions are not centralized. If the team wants to change it, that's fine too. But that's a fun one that I'll point to that.
I
people
love
care
that
more
one. If
about.
I can get that implemented across foundation, because I walk around without my shoes and I'm the odd person out.
It's
That
definitely
would be a
more
fun one.
comfortable in my opinion. Yeah.
As part of this journey, and you talked about sort of firing yourself from jobs and hiring leaders and over time hiring leaders of leaders. Can you talk a little bit about some of the mistakes you made and some of the lessons you learned along the way? Because, I'm sure for every 10 leaders you hire, a couple of them didn't work out for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. So I'll point to a couple, and probably ones that are watch outs for everyone. So definitely the transition to like building out an executive team. What's that like? I by no means had a 100% track record. Um, Maybe the tip I'll give is like anytime you're opening a search, and now I've done searches for almost every type of role possible. It's a chance to learn, and if you have the budget and can hire an external search firm and get the pipeline in place, you're basically kind of learning by talking to some of the best people in that field. And it's not just screening them. You're actually able to ask them questions and learn about their approach to
Yep.
things. So definitely approach interviewing. I call it the calibration phase of any search. But when I start a search, I want to look and cast a pretty wide net of different profiles, different approaches to the job. And mostly I'm just asking tons and tons of questions, whether that's like hiring our first CFO or our first CMO or our first whatever job it might be. So that's kind of one tip on executive search. um, I think the other one I can point to, a little bit for me ties to my prior startup, but I think it might be relevant to folks. My prior startup was me and a friend in 2008 when Facebook platform got launched, and we were building kind of a very easy way for kind of businesses to build apps on the Facebook platform when you were kind of native inside the Canvas app ecosystem. And so, the lesson from that was we kind of spent a few days, built some stuff, put some ad banners in. We're making $1,000 a day, and we're like, wow, we have a business. And we didn't start with a pain point. We didn't start with a problem. We didn't start with a broader goal or even a thing that our customers want. We just kind of became optimizers of algorithms for ad-based monetization. And you probably can all guess, a lot of learnings from that, and Gusto being almost the polar opposite. That was a lot of learnings that I had to go through and introspection, and that chapter ended up being a chapter of learning for me. But for me, the advice I would give entrepreneurs, especially if you're thinking of starting a company, is really start with the problem. And on top of that, imagine it's the 10,000th time or 100,000th time you're describing what you're doing, and will you be as excited as the first time? And in my prior chapter, we were in stealth, and I didn't even know what to tell people. With Gusto, this is probably my millionth time describing what we're up to, and I love it. I believe in it. I care about it. I want to dedicate years and years of my life to it, decades of my life to it, and you can't fake that. So the tip there again is really try to be honest with yourself. If this is something you want to build and a mission that you really feel authentic to, like imagine it's that 100,000th time describing it, and will you be as excited as the first time?
Well, you're clearly having a lot of fun. It sounds like you're ready to do it another million times.
I feel super excited. I think we're early. We're 10 years in, and I think we're super early in this journey. And I'm authentically just really, really excited and fascinated with the problems that we can go help customers with. And so I feel lucky to have found this area.
Well, congratulations. I mean, a decade, 200,000 customers, $10 billion valuation. That's a lot to celebrate. What did you do
Team
to
effort. What did I do? Well, team effort, right? Obviously, the beauty of a founder journey is you realize very quickly how much it takes a lot of folks contributing and choosing to be a part of the journey. But what did I do to celebrate? What we try to do, we actually we did a cool all hands internally, and then we actually published some stuff. We try to put all the focus on customers. So we actually we had Gusties come and share stories, anecdotes of their customer experience from like a 1 year tenured Gustie, 2 year tenured Gustie, 3, 4 year, 5 year, 7, 8, 9, 10 year Gustie, and then we also chose some customers to spotlight in our content.
When you take a step back and you look at sort of the sum total of the last 10 years, I'm sure there's hundreds of decisions you've made, maybe probably thousands, many that you got right, a few you got wrong. But is there one or two that really stand out that you look at and say, at this critical juncture, we made X decision, and this is why we're still here today and doing as well as you are.
Yeah, and I'll make it clear too. I mean, there's a lot of intentionality and luck that enables a company to be successful. Good timing is a big piece of it as well.
Absolutely.
And yeah, we've obviously not been perfect by any stretch. Just to be really transparent, like if anyone's a customer on the call here, when COVID started, we actually didn't know what was going to happen. I don't think anyone did. We kind of went into kind of a let's go week by week and just track what's happening. Let's help small and medium businesses survive. So the due north was very clear, and that was a really big rallying cry for the team. But from a business lens, were we going to grow? Were we going to shrink? What was going to happen? We ended up growing 50% in that most intense period. So ultimately, a lot of growth. And then we were understaffed. So we've been navigating a unique puzzle, a self-inflicted one, and one that's just as painful of basically having less folks on our support teams than we need. We've now caught up. That was a realization we had earlier this year. We've added several hundred folks to those teams to reach and map the scale of customers we're getting. But that was painful, right? Just to make it clear, we're not perfect. We're always trying to get better. We're always trying to improve, and that's to me one of the most important mindsets to have as a founder, as an entrepreneur, is never to think, "Hey, we've made it," or somehow we've been successful. I don't like using that term. We've made progress. We made lots of progress over the last 10 years, but we're still super early in actually living up to the potential of what I think is possible here. Some other decisions, I think, focusing on values early on and making sure that's a key part of how we hire. It means turning away, and we did lots of candidates who mapped to skill alignment, right? So we think about hiring as about alignment.
Yep.
I don't believe you convince someone to join you, and I don't think candidates convince you to hire them. You're both trying to figure out, can we do something great together? And for us, that alignment falls in 3 buckets: values, motivation, and skill. And if you hire only for the first 2, you get a bunch of people cheerleading. So you got to have skill. That matters.
Yeah.
But inversely, if all you look for is skill, then you end up with really no common culture at all, because you, by definition, now have many different value systems inside your company. So I would say that's probably been the most important one on the how. And then from a strategy lens, we can unpack a bunch more, but definitely I think, starting with payroll has been incredibly strategic. It's unlocked a lot more platform work for us, because it's where ultimately what we would call the employee system of record naturally resides for a small and medium-sized business. And so a lot of our product work has been about expanding around that core, around payroll.
As we start to wrap up, you've shared a lot of nuggets along the way around, advice for founders at different stages, things that, you did right, things that lessons you learned. Is there any, one final piece of advice for founders, CEOs who are literally in year one? They're at ground zero. They're trying to figure this out. When you look back, what is the one thing you would say to them? No pressure.
I think, maybe 2 things come to mind. One, I'm just going to amplify because I believe in it so much. And then the second one's newer. So the first one is just really, truly, again, if you were endeavoring to build a business for a multi-year kind of longer term arc, really make sure that the problem space you're tackling speaks to you, because your product is going to evolve, the strategy will evolve, your role is going to evolve. But like the specific reason why you exist, what you're trying to make better in the world, ideally wouldn't evolve that much. And ideally, It's something that really like you dream about, like fall asleep thinking about, can't stop thinking about. And you can't fake that. Again, it's impossible to fake that, in my opinion. So just really, really, truly, spend the time to be introspective and make sure that that's the case. And then the second one is on the topic of introspection. Make sure you set aside the time to go disconnect from the day-to-day. Pre-COVID, we had a tradition, and we'll see if it also persists, but on everyone's 1-year anniversary would kind of get them a plane ticket anywhere in the world. And the whole impetus for that program was to encourage folks to take a step back, to clear their head, to disconnect from what is all too often the norm in a startup, which is the tactical execution of like answering a call for a sales call, writing some more code for a product feature, or doing a design sprint. Like there's so much to do. So the tip would be, in whatever way is authentic to you, whether it's weekly, quarterly, monthly, you need to create time for that introspection experience, and on not just the what, which is strategy, but also the how. And if you don't, it's very easy to get caught up in just the day-to-day execution work.
The one common theme I've sort of picked up over the last half an hour or so is the level of intentionality you've had around the how. I think founders are more often than not very intentional about the what. I think the how ends up being, and it's part of the Silicon Valley myth, it's just hustle your way through the how. And clearly you've had a very different approach to that, and it served you well. I want to zoom out of Gusto and just, get your perspective on the landscape more broadly, and really on two dimensions. The first is really around enterprise software generally. The world of enterprise software has changed a lot in the last decade. Many people say that we've seen 5 to 8 years of acceleration in the last 18 months on adoption of technology. So curious what you think. Where is the world of enterprise software headed?
Yeah, so I'll give a couple of points of view here. So first off, I'll kind of change the framing a bit. So we live and breathe small and medium business. I know you're probably more talking about business software, but we definitely do not think a lot about enterprise at the present. But I think literally that, like small and medium sized companies getting access to great experiences is still a relatively new thing.
Yep.
And this has always been a gigantic market. Just to give folks some grounding, there's about 6 million employers in the US. 98% of those employers are sub 100 employees, and over 50% are sub 5 employees. And from a workforce lens, about a third of the workforce is sub 100 employees. So these are all big markets, but again, SMB is a big market. And it's a combination of the right technology ingredients and the right go-to-market viability that makes this segment now, again, possible to build great businesses in. And we're not the only ones tackling that, right? Folks like Shopify, Square, and others have really shown that quite well. And so that's a trend I'll point to that I'm excited about.
Yeah.
Another one I'll point to is what many call vertical SaaS, but the ability to take a specific industry segment and actually build a best of breed experience for that specific industry. You could call it a niche, but some of these are quite large. A fun one I like to point to is like Slice, that's building out all the best SaaS software for independent pizza shops across America. It turns out there's 40,000 of them. Or Squire, that's building out the best SaaS for barbershops, right? And so that's a cool trend. One way that Gusto, by the way, plays into that is in embedded software, which itself is another trend. So we have a product we call Gusto Embedded Payroll, but the ability through an API to go add payroll into your software product as a platform and actually have your own payroll powered by Gusto, more analogous to kind of the Twilio Stripe business models,
Yep.
is something that we've been focused on more recently, and I'm really, really excited about. So I think that's another trend that's pretty exciting, kind of in the context of how platforms coexist and embed and connect to each other. I'll pause there. Those are two big ones.
And so I think both of those trends, I think, resonate very strongly and obviously, have accelerated during COVID because the demand for software has gone up. How has the process of customer acquisition, especially in the context of small and mid-sized businesses, changed? Is it, what's changed if you look back from 10 years ago to today?
I mean, I would just say COVID has accelerated what was already happening. So again, like look at even just the core parts of payroll. And we talk about Gusto today as the people platform. There's much, much more there than just payroll. But purely looking at payroll, you had, when we started Gusto, about 3 million companies from our research that were literally doing it by hand, offline all too often in a very localized way. And now, that's still about 2.2 million. So you've had a trend there of some folks adopting digital solutions, and there's still a huge number that you really could call greenfield that are actually still doing it in a way that's not ideal for their business. So that trend continues, right? Things that like we think of as old hat, like SaaS. Oh, well, SaaS is like Salesforce 20 years ago. No, SaaS is still a new thing for many companies in many parts of the country, many parts of the world. So that's one thing I would point to. Maybe the other is just that desire for integrated experiences, right? Companies don't want to have 50, 100 different SaaS apps or tools to leverage. So, a lot of work we're doing again at Gusto is about platformization. So being able to build into Gusto, if you're a developer entrepreneur and want to go build an experience and distribute through Gusto, we welcome that. Or inversely, our ability to connect into other platforms is another trend that I think that's been accelerated. Again, really driven by what's better for the small medium business rather than them having to go manage many, many different systems in a siloed way.
Makes sense. I have a couple of audience questions I'll quickly zoom through before we sort of wrap up. There's a question around your experience with YC. Of course, this was a long time ago, but the question is, why did you decide to join YC, and what role did YC play in your growth trajectory?
Yes, we were in YC, the winter 2012 batch, and some quick tips I'll give. I mean, first off, and this is definitely the case for us, we were going to start Gusto regardless. So to me, the journey of starting a business is all about the pain point and the problem. We were really excited and thrilled to be in YC because for us, it was just a really good experience on a couple dimensions. Number one, we liked the shared experience of doing kind of that batch program process. And it timeline-wise mapped perfectly to kind of the first few months of our journey. There's obviously a nice accelerant on fundraising if you're able to be kind of at a good point to raise money. And for us, we really stood out in our batch, and we're so able to do kind of an outsized seed round. We did a $6 million seed round out of YC, which was really, again, a
By
boon
2012, that was a Series A.
It was a grateful thing that we're really excited that gave us a good foundation, I would say. And a big part of that was also the YC impact to it. And then maybe three, we definitely got some early product customer feedback. One thing I would point out though, if you're building out a developer platform, probably even it's more powerful. We really quickly wanted to focus not on tech companies. We wanted to go after mainstream businesses outside of Silicon Valley, outside of the kind of tech bubble that we're in. So that's kind of one thing that I'll point to that was kind of in parallel to the YC experience.
That's great. Thank you. Josh, there are a couple of questions on IPO plans. I'm assuming you don't want to answer these, so I'll skip those for now, unless you're dying to sort of share your timeline.
I mean, I'll just say, not surprisingly, no timeline to share in this context. We're a private company today. Like the advice I would give entrepreneurs, maybe is the better way to think about it, is these are big, important milestones, any milestone, whether it's a fundraising milestone, customer milestone, product milestone. Think about how do you celebrate those moments, show appreciation, but also ground the team and the company and what's the broader goal. And for us, if we've done our job well, you ask any Gusty, the broader goal is always related to the customer. It's not related to us, right? It's related to like what we do for our customer, how we serve them, how we solve their problems, the folks out there that we're not helping yet. And so that's a big part of how we think about scaling and growing at Gusto. And then there are some nice, again, moments to celebrate and acknowledge, including the transition to being public. But they really should be steps in the journey, not really viewed as destinations in my mind.
Thank you so much, Josh. Once again, congratulations on your 10th anniversary. I'm pretty sure we'll be celebrating your 20th in no time. So thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll do this again in 10 years.
Thank you. I'll have a bit more white hair by then, but hopefully just as excited.
Take care.
Thank you.